Thank you for being here. It's been quite a humbling summer for me. And I keep thinking, boy, I've gotten a lot of attention for a little farm boy that all I did was throw a ball 60 feet 6 inches. You know, and as my mother used to say, she had not a great deal of interest in baseball. She was busy sewing, making wedding dresses for the local brides, and they would say, Nancy, we heard your son Jim is a pretty good baseball player. And she said, you know, I've heard that. She said, I think he's the one that throws the ball so they can hit it. And I had to tell her later that sometimes I did that a little too well. But, you know, one of the things I love to talk about is what great parents I had, what an influence they were on my career and on my life. The game that Ed mentioned, yes, it was memorable in 1974, and I remember it well when Nolan having the no-hitter going into the 9th inning, and I had given up line drives all over the place with only one run, and one of my favorite teammates was Dick Allen, and Dick was playing first base, and my nickname was Old Timer, because I was the oldest guy in the club, even at 36, I think. And as we're running off after the third out in the top of the 9th, he patted me on the backside. He said, Old Timer, we're going to win this game. And Dick was not just a power hitter, but he had speed. So he led off the bottom of the 9th with a routine ground ball to third. And the third baseman took maybe just an extra look at it, and boom, he beats it out. We bunt a man over, they throw it away. Base hit, sacrifice fly, 2-1 we win. I think we got one hit in that game. So, but Dick Allen made that all happen. My book, 8 Decades in Baseball. No, I didn't play for 80 years, but working with my broadcast partner Bob Costas for the last 14 years, he was adamant about saying, I want you to announce games with me at least in 2020, because in your career we'll have touched 8 decades. And then Doug Lyons, who was co-authored a lot of books. Some of you may have heard of his brother Jeffrey Lyons. He was a longtime theater critic in New York City. And Doug said, if you ever write another book, I'd like to co-author it with you. And we talked about what to do, and we thought, well, let's just cut it up into decades, and I'll talk about the experiences I had in each of the 8 decades, you know, starting with kind of the way the game has changed, how I fell in love with the game, and how now I've kind of walked away from the game because it's become a little more of a science project than I was accustomed to when I played. But I fell in love with the game on June 26, 1946. It's amazing how I can't remember what I was supposed to do yesterday, as Margie did tell me, but I can tell you great detail about that day. So my dad and my Uncle John drove to Detroit. We saw a doubleheader between the Red Sox and the Tigers. The Red Sox actually won the pennant that year in '46. And I saw Ted Williams hit 2, Hank Greenberg, Hal Newhouser, all Hall of Famers, Bobby Dorr. But the thing that really struck me is when I walked up the ramp to find our seats in the second deck above the Tiger dugout, this dark green cathedral opened up in front of me. There weren't any billboards or any music going on. It was just the greenest grass I'd ever seen, the whitest white uniforms I'd ever seen. And I looked out there at 7 years old, and I think even then I said, I want to be one of those guys. And that was such a memorable day for me. That's why later, when I was doing Yankee games for the Madison Square Garden Network, Deb Kaufman was the pregame host. And she said, you saw your first games here? And I said, yes, I did. She said, would you do a pregame show somewhere near the seats where you were in 1946? And so they weren't the exact ones, but I said, sure. So she began to ask me questions about it, and I recited just what I told you. Well, Peter Hurt, who's one of the Hurt brothers that runs the Elias Sports Bureau, and they're the statistical Bible of all sports. And Peter said, yeah, these players think they remember you know, what happened back then, but most of the time they got it all wrong. And he emailed me a couple days after that show, and he said, pretty well right on. There was 43,000 people there. I knew the scores of the game. So as you can tell, from age 7, baseball has really been in my blood. My dad was not a skilled player, but an avid fan. In fact, I mentioned this in my induction speech at Cooperstown that before video games and TV, I don't think we had our first TV till early 50s, baseball trivia was a popular game with him, and he would quiz me on a lot of things. And I knew the first 5 inductees into the Hall of Fame when I was 8 years old. You know, Kaat, and Babe Ruth was there, Hannes Wagner, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, and so I was kind of raised on baseball history. Little did I know that was very beneficial to me when I got into announcing 30-some years ago. So I had a great foundation for being involved in baseball. You know, fortunate to have pitched and got to know fairly well Ted Williams in 1959, spoke at the opening of his tunnel in Boston, and then now, you know, I actually just found out, I think a couple of weeks ago, from the president of the Hall of Fame, he was watching The Captain, the series on Derek Jeter. And he said, I didn't know you did Derek Jeter's first game and you did his last game. And I didn't know that either, but I would say Derek's last game was probably one of the highlights of my announcing career. Because I told Bob Costas that day, I said, this should be the easiest game we've ever done, because we don't have to say anything. We had Derek. We had a dedicated camera that followed Derek wherever he went. And if you remember that game, the Yankees were going to lose. They came up with a couple and tied it. And then he got the winning hit in the 10th inning to win the game. So you can read in the book all the stats that are in there and the experiences I've had, but mostly it was just the people I got to play with. You know, whatever business we're in, it comes down really to people and relationships. I had it was an emotional day yesterday, but yet a very, you know, it was kind of an uplifting day. I went to the funeral service of my teammate Bruce Sutter. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Bruce. He was in the ill health lately, and a lot of my teammates were there, and it was really a celebration of his life. But there I gathered again with a lot of my teammates that I had in the 80s, and you know, it's amazing in all businesses. It's just the relationships you have that come back and are so, you know, so memorable and rewarding to you. So yeah, I think as a baseball player, when I was a kid, it's all I dreamed about doing was being a ball player. Got to play in the World Series in 1965 against the great Sandy Koufax. So I wrote about that in the 60s. Ed mentioned the game in the 70s. 40 years ago today, I earned this. I didn't earn it. My team earned this World Series ring. It was 40 years ago today that we beat the Brewers 6-3 in Game 7 of the World Series. So that was the 80s. And then in the 90s, actually in the 70s, if there was a rain delay, you didn't have cable TV then, so they would call up one of the players, Richie Ashburn and Harry Callis. You remember them very well, being a Phillies fan. They would call down, we were at Wrigley Field, and they said, well, Jim, come up and just tell stories. And that's what we did. And there was a producer there with Major League Films, Jody Shapiro, and he said, you ought to think about getting into this business when you're done playing. Of course, when you're playing, you think you're going to play forever. So you don't look too far into the future about what you're going to do afterwards. So lo and behold, we had a player strike in 1981. And I get a call from Jody, and he was running Home Team Sports in Washington. He said, how'd you like to go to Rochester and work a game with Ralph Kiner? And so I had done some broadcasting in the off-season. You know, in the early days, we had to work in the off-season. So one of my jobs one winter was doing high school sports, basketball, football. And so that's where it started. Actually, the shortstop that night for the Rochester Red Wings was Cal Ripken Jr. It was the Orioles Farm Club. So that's where the broadcast started. I had such great help from Bill White, who I still consider my broadcast mentor. If you're a Yankee fan, you remember Bill and Scooter. And that was quite an education, working one season with all of those. And then, of course, I mentioned the World Series. My friend Doug is writing a book about Hall of Fame trivia. And two of the distinctions I have are not records of accomplishment, so I'm not boasting about things I did. But when we went to the World Series in '65, we had a good team, but we ran into Mr. Koufax, and I never got back until 1982. So in 1997, I'm watching the Orioles play the Indians. We still call them the Indians and not the Guardians. And the Tribe's a group of like-minded people. I always thought a baseball team was kind of a tribe. And my friend Tim McCarver was on the call, and he said, well, if the Orioles win tonight, they'll be going back to the World Series for the first time in 14 years for Cal Ripken, who holds the all-time record for the most time between World Series appearances. And I scratched my head and I said, I think I'm the answer to that question. And I was, 17 years. And then in 1982, earning this World Series ring, I became the only professional player in any professional sport that had to wait 24 years to get a championship ring. Ray Bork had held that. I think Ray went 22 seasons. So, that's what a great life it's been for me to be involved in this sport for as long as I have been. And I always want to point out how fragile it is between making it in a professional sport and not. I mean, there are so many little twists and turns where somebody has to do something right for you. And I had my manager, Jack McKeon, at my induction. I don't know if that name means anything to you, Trader Jack, or the San Diego Padres. Well, he was my playing manager in 1958, Missoula, Montana, in the Pioneer League. Boise Braves had a cleanup hitter, 23-year-old veteran catcher, Bob Euchre. He was a cleanup hitter for the Boise Braves. So I started out that year 1-4, and I thought, well, one more bad start, and they're going to send me home. And Jack called me over and he said, kid, you're going to pitch every 4 days for me. You might even pitch a little relief in between because we only had 7 pitchers. We had a 17-man roster. And come September, I pitched 240 innings. I learned a lot about myself, a lot about pitching. And without the support of Jack McKeon, I wouldn't be standing here today and wouldn't have had the time I did in the major leagues. And I had great coaches, Johnny Sade, Eddie Lopat. But I think it all starts with parents. Give a little idea of the way my dad thinks. Now, I was a pretty decent high school basketball player, not because of my height. I could dribble, I could pass, I could play defense. We had good teams. I got some awards for that. But one night I was way over my skis. I think I scored about twice as many points as I normally do. So I lived 2 blocks from the gymnasium, walking home through the snow thinking, wow, I wonder what my dad's going to say about that game I had tonight. And I walked in the door and he couple draws on his corncob pipe, and he said, well, Carl threw you some nice passes tonight, didn't he? So, that kind of put it in perspective. So I think the fact that I was raised by a dad that was so far ahead of his time, you could not imagine this happening today. But when I was scouted in 1957, I was pitching for a small college, Hope College in Holland, Michigan. And I was pitching against Kalamazoo College. Actually, as an aside story, when a young player later came out of that area that was a prospect, they'd say, where's he from? And I said, well, he's from right near Zeeland where Jim Kaat is from. Well, fast forward 20 years, at least 30 years, and they would say, well, this school has a really good player. Where is he from? He said, well, he's from right near Kalamazoo where Derek Jeter's from. So Derek Jeter kind of, but that's who I was pitching against that day, Kalamazoo College. And my scout, the scout that signed me, actually went there to see the Kalamazoo pitcher. And we had a good game. We won the game. He said, well, I better go back see that kid again. Went back the next week. We won that game. So he called my dad and said, I want him to, come down to Washington and try out with then Washington Senators. We became the Minnesota Twins, but in the 50s up till 1961, we were still the Washington Senators. So I went down to Chicago. Cookie Lavagetto said, kid, you'll be on my staff in 2 years if you sign with us. Of course, I'm all pumped up when we're driving home, and my dad said, well, he might tell a lot of young players that. He wants to boost their confidence. But sure enough, Dick called and he said, we want to offer your son a contract for $4,000 because if you got more than $4,000 in 1957, you had to occupy a seat on the Major League roster for 2 years. That happened to Sandy Koufax and Harmon Killebrew, 2 Hall of Famers, but their careers took a long time to get on track. For 2 years they basically sat there and didn't do much. And my dad followed all the stories of the guys that got $25,000, $30,000, $35,000, but they kind of rotted away sitting on the Major League bench for 2 years, never getting to play. So in the meantime, Pete Melito, the White Sox scout, called and said, we heard your son's going to sign. He said, I think we can get him $25,000 from the White Sox because I think he'll be in the big leagues in 2 years. Now my dad made $72 a week in 1957. He said to Pete, thank you, but Jim's going to take the 4. He's going to go to the minor leagues and learn how to play the game. And so that decision impacted my career in such a way that I can't imagine if he had not insisted to do that, if I ever would have made it. But that gives you an idea of how he thought. He was looking out for my best interest. So obviously that was that was one of the turning points in my career. I did do my last game August 18th of this year. I had called the Major League, the MLB network. Bob Costas and I did games for 14 seasons. There again was such good timing. My late wife had passed away in 2008. And so I had walked away from the Yes Network. I was doing Yankee games for 13 years. And all of a sudden, the MLB network launches in 2009. And I get a call from Tony Petitti, who was the CEO, and he said, we heard you might want to do some games again. Well, I had some friends in the broadcast booth that had broadcast business that were prodding him, call it. We need to get him back in the booth again. So as it turns out, Tony said, how'd you like to do some games again on the MLB network? I said, well, I would, but I don't want to do a lot of games, and I don't want to travel like I did during most of my career. So he said, well, how many would you be willing to do? And I was kind of kidding him. I said, maybe about 10. I thought he'd say 40 or 50. And he said, well, that's perfect, because that's all Bob Costas can do with his NBC schedule. So there we started in 2009 doing 10 to 12 games a year, and this is the 14th year that we've done it. But this will be my last year. As I said, I think the game needs a younger retired player who is more familiar with how science is impacting the game. So if you do have the book, you'll read about all those stories. But I think really what's most important on a night like tonight is, and I find this at every bookstore or library that I speak at, people have a lot of questions about what's going on in the game today. And so that's what I want to open it up for, is for any of you that have questions. That usually leads to some pretty good discussion. So feel free to raise your hand and we'll get it started. Yes, right back.
What took the baseball record so long to put you in the Hall of Fame?
Well,
123 wins and 16 games.
Well, the question, if you didn't hear it, what took the writers so long to put me in the Hall of Fame? Well, see, when your playing career is over, there's a 5-year waiting period. And then you're on the ballot for 15 years. I never got more than, I think, about 30%. I used to kid some of the writers that I knew well, like Bill Madden from New York, because one year I think I got 130 votes. And then the next year I got 125. So I said to Bill, did you vote for me this year? Just kidding him, I didn't want him. I said, because I haven't thrown a pitch in like 30 years, but I lost 5 votes. Well, what I soon discovered is that the Hall of Fame for starting pitchers were mostly the perennial all-stars, the dominant guys, Seaver, Gibson, Koufax, Marichal, you know, perennial all-stars. And you know, they were like your Kentucky Derby horses, and I was kind of like running down here at the fairgrounds. But I did it over a period of time. So I think this year, for the first time, after your 15 years is up, you then go on the Veterans Committee. And that's a committee of 16 people, 8 former players, 4 former executives, 4 former writers. And for years, a lot of the members of that committee were not at all familiar with your playing career. They were new in baseball, or they were big donors to the Hall of Fame, so they got on the committee. But this year, for the first time, I really thought I had a chance, because I was playing golf down in Florida a little over a year ago with my teammate Mike Schmidt from the Phillies. And I get asked that question that you just asked me, and I said, I've kind of put the Hall of Fame in my rearview mirror, because I was not the dominant starting pitcher. I was kind of the number 2 guy, but I did it over a period of time. And Schmidt said, don't be too sure. He said, I'm going to be on the committee this year. And of course, he had written articles in the past to support me. And so I looked at the committee. Well, Fergie Jenkins was there. He was very supportive. Joe Torre, Rod Carew, and Ozzie Smith, guys I played with and against. And an executive who I saw yesterday, John Sherholtz from the Braves. So I thought, well, I got a chance. And you need 12 out of 16. You need 75%. It's a little easier becoming president of the United States than the Hall of Fame. So, and the sad part of it is my teammate Dick Allen missed by 1 vote. See, there's 10. They start out with about 100 former players that are eligible, and they narrow it down to the top 10 vote getters, and then you're on the ballot. And then they can vote for 4. Well, Dick got 11, we got 12. The sweetest call I got was on Monday morning. Willa Allen, Dick's widow, called. She was, oh, Dick would be so happy. I said, Willa, think about it. If it came down to that last voter, and he said, well, I got to vote between Jim or Dick Allen, could just as easily have voted for Dick Allen. So that's how fine the line is. But then I think the way it was such a nerve-wracking day. I've been through it a couple times before, but the Hall of Fame calls and said, okay, you're on the ballot. The committee is meeting Sunday. They're going to announce it on TV at 6 o'clock. So between 5:15, 5:45, if you could be near your phone, if you are elected, you'll get a phone call. Well, they don't call with bad news. So, you're watching golf, you're watching football, you're doing everything you can, you got your phone there. I was actually telling Jane Clark, who's the president of the Hall of Fame, I was fortunate to get a ride with her in her plane down to Bruce's service and back, and she's the one that calls. And I said, I was looking at my phone, it was about 5:35, I had about 10 minutes left. And the phone buzzes, and it's an area 917. I said, well, Cooperstown 607. I said, well, I'll answer it anyway. And the words come out, this is Jane Clark from the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Well, your life changes just like that. I mean, it is amazing this summer, the magnitude of the attention that being a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and not just the attention, but just the benefits of the people. 2 weeks ago I hosted the annual Pathfinder Golf Classic. Well, Pathfinder Lodge is a little community right outside of Cooperstown. It has 90 residents, all with Down syndrome. And so one of my duties was to go out there and I pitch kickball. I'd say kids, but they're not kids. I mean, the oldest one there was like 52. And so there's all those kind of opportunities if they like to send us to, and the Hall of Fame is and Jane is a very philanthropic person, so that's another, one of the other strong points of being part of it. And so, yeah, it's been quite a humbling summer, and of course, to go in with my teammate and friend Tony Oliva made it twice as sweet.
Well deserved.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
What was your lifetime batting average?
About $190.
And how many home runs?
16.
What effect do you think, besides extending the career of sluggers, has the DH had, pro or con, for Major League Baseball?
Well, it's had a positive effect for a lot of the hitters. Eddie Murray, Paul Molitor, Edgar Martinez, Big Papi, the DH. I didn't like it when it first came in because as a kid, we took pride on being a baseball player, just happened to be a pitcher. You learned to bunt, you learned to run the bases. In fact, just as a quick aside, Doug, who was coming out with his book of Hall of Fame trivia, he gave you this question. I'm one of two pitchers. One happened in 1925, and mine happened in 1970. That was walked intentionally and then ended up scoring a run. so actually Bob Boland, who I happen to hit pretty well, he walked me intentionally. You wouldn't think of a pitcher that happening to a pitcher, but we really took pride in that. So at first, I didn't like the DH, just didn't feel like you were part of the game. Well, today, you need the DH because pitchers have no clue because how to swing a bat. Because in high school, there's a DH. Everything's so specialized. They don't know how to run the bases, they don't know how to slide, they don't know how to field, so it's kind of embarrassing to let them hit. Whereas I think in the 60s, Gibby, Warren Spahn, who was one, I think Spahn had 36 home runs. But yeah, the DH has had a very positive effect on some of the hitters that got in there because of their hitting ability. Yes, sir.
This may be an unfair question. Do you have one favorite team that you played?
It's really hard to pick a favorite from personnel-wise, but there's no question that the 1982 Cardinals. To finish my career, that was my 24th full season. We hit 67 home runs as a team. Aaron Judge hit 62 individually. But we stole 200 bases. And every night, Whitey Herzog would say, get us 10 singles, boys. Willie McGee would get on first, next thing he's on third, and show you the difference in the game, because we played on AstroTurf. The object was hit the ball on the ground. You didn't want to hit the ball in the air. Well, now, everybody either hits in the air or they strike out. One of the two. I was talking with some baseball people at Bruce's, I was actually talking to Brian Snitker, the manager of the Braves. And we were talking about how Tony Gwynn hit all those three pitchers so well, Maddox, Smoltz, and Glavine. He hit like 400 off all of them. I said, the game has scouted Tony Gwynn out. There's no room for him anymore. Dave Kingman would be a #1 draft pick because they all want the home run. But that's what was so much fun being a part of the Cardinals at 82 because the Expos had a strong team, the Phillies had a strong team, but we had great defense, good relief pitching, and of course, yesterday we talked a lot about it. We had Bruce Sutter at the end of the game, and that's when closers, they go 2 innings and they might pitch 5 days in a row. Heaven forbid they give them a day off. It just didn't happen. So I still have great relationships with the guys that I played on from the Phillies, Mike Schmidt, Timmy McCarver. The White Sox, I don't see too many of those. That was a great time for me because of Dick Allen. And the Twins, of course, gave me my opportunity. And during the 60s, I think we were probably the winningest team in the 60s. We won the pennant in 65 and divisions in 69 and 70. Yes?
Have you pitched Jim Rice?
How do I pitch Jim Rice?
Have you?
Have you pitched to Jim? I've pitched to Jim Rice.
Yeah.
Yeah? He hits the ball hard. And he hits a golf ball hard too. He's a good golfer. But yeah, I pitched against Jim Rice, and I saw him this year at the Hall of Fame. And You know, I'm glad he got in, because for years he wasn't getting the credit that he, so you must be a Red Sox fan, huh?
Actually, I like the Braves.
Really? Braves fan, he said. Well, I was telling Brian Snitker yesterday, I said, I feel badly for you, because you won 100 games, but in a short series, anything can happen. And it's much more difficult to win something over 6 months than it is just to win something in 5 days. But these are the games that attract people now. It's the playoffs. And, you know, back when baseball owned the summer, when I started following it, pitchers and catchers report mid-February. Baseball owned it until October. Now hockey, basketball, they don't end until June. So people don't get quite as interested in the full season as they did years ago. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for coming tonight and congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, the game is so different from when you were pitching, certainly different from when I was a kid growing up. You kind of touched on that. And you said something earlier about, you know, it's kind of too scientific. But the game kind of, in my opinion, has changed so much. It's not even, you know, resembling the game that I remember playing.
Right.
That I remember watching. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, you can't slide into anybody. You can't, you know, everything's controlled. Setup guy, even if the guy pitches 90 pitches, you know, the setup guy has to come in a certain inning, the closer has to come in a certain, and it's very contrived. And, you know, when you said it was much more scientific, I don't know if you're referring to that or other things, or you can elaborate on that.
Well, the question was about how the game has become more of a science project today. And, you know, I kind of enjoyed the game. As Jack McKeon told me when he managed me in '58, and we reminisced about this at the induction. I get to the 8th inning, 2 men on, tie game. He'd trot halfway out to the mound. He might get there and spit a little tobacco juice on my shoe and flip me the ball, say, well, kid, you got into it, figure out a way to get out of it. And I never had a pitching coach till I got to the big leagues. Now they have assistant pitching coach, a game planning coach. And so I kind of, if I actually, knowing what I know, if I had the ability and I looked at the way baseball is today, my second choice of what to do as a career would have been to be a high school basketball coach. And I think rather than play today, I still love the game, I just don't like the way it's operated. And I think, you know, when the players, they're so much bigger, stronger, faster in all sports. They made the golf courses longer for Tiger Woods. They need to make the NBA playing floor bigger. But in baseball, they make the ballpark smaller and the guys are bigger and faster and stronger. And they take the brushback pitch away. And like you said, they can't slide into second base. They've made it, you know, they're afraid of the injuries because the guys today are, I mean, Mickey Lolich was one of the great pitchers that I wished he would get in the Hall of Fame. I don't know how many of you know about Mickey Lolich. He pitched for the Tigers, and we hooked up many times. I think he had 30 complete games one year, 370 innings. And Mickey owned a donut shop, and he was kind of, he said, you know, you can't pull fat, so I never get injured. He didn't pull any muscles. But, yeah.
Having a relief pitcher or
yeah. Well,
take him out if you needed to.
Last night was a good example. I don't know if you followed the Phillies and the Padres, and I remember at the golf club I was a member at down in Florida, Tony Petitti, who actually hired me, was a member. So I walk in one day and I said, Tony, I heard that there's a new rule that a relief pitcher has to face 3 men. I said, that's the stupidest rule I've ever heard. It ruins the strategy of the game. He said, don't say too much about it. It was my idea. I said, Tony, you were a catcher in college. You know, well, last night, the Phillies bring in this Brad Hand, who was a really dominant reliever in his prime. He's not quite as dominant anymore, but he didn't get the left-hand hitter out. So I'm scratching my head saying, why doesn't he take him out and bring in the righty? Well, he couldn't do it. He had to face 2 more hitters. So it kind of alters, little things like that are altering the strategy of the game.
Actually, anybody have to put somebody on second base.
Yeah. It's just a lot different, and I'm so thankful that I played in the era that I did. I'd have people for years say, boy, I bet wish you were playing today, you'd be making $30 million a year. I said, you know, if I didn't play in the era that I played in, I would have loved to have played in the era before that. Because I think the golden era of baseball was from right after World War II, 46, when I saw my first games, until the teams moved out west. The farthest team west was St. Louis. And you played each team 22 times. There was some real battles. And yeah, and they didn't have playoffs. You won it over 162, and that was it. Yes?
You had a wonderful nickname back then, Kitty Cat.
Yeah.
Did you love that name or did you hate it?
It didn't make any difference whether I loved it or didn't. Well, I'll tell you how it came about. The Cardinals had a left-hand pitcher named Harry the Cat Burkeen, and he was quick. He was a good fielder. Then Harvey Haddix came along. He pitched for the Pirates, and they called him the Kitten. Harry the Cat, Harvey was the Kitten. He was quick. So now I come to spring training, and everybody pronounces my name Cat. So Chuck Stobbs, a veteran, and these guys, you know, you could imagine what a rookie goes through in spring training with, and especially in those days because there were no guaranteed contracts. So they knew that I was coming along and I was going to take one of their buddies' jobs. So they were not always, you know, overly friendly or helpful. But anyway, they would kid me about, well, you got a brother Bob, Bobcat, Tomcat, and then they noticed that I was pretty quick in the field, and that's kind of how that involved that nickname. But yeah, whenever somebody calls me that, I know they're a good friend. Yes?
So how you doing?
Fine, thanks.
I'm Hall of Fame. I'd like to know, in your opinion, who you personally saw play in each position as the best you ever saw personally.
The best player?
No, best player per position.
Oh, per position? It'd take me a while to do that. Yeah, there's so many good ones. I mean, announcing wise, I think Ken Griffey Jr. is probably as talented a player as I've seen. You know, Willie Mays, when you see his catch, his famous catch, and no disrespect for Willie, but there's 15 center fielders now that make those kind of plays, going back to Devon White, Marquise Grissom, who played for your Braves, and Kirby Puckett, Andrew Jones. They're so much more athletic today than we were. I noticed that when I was doing Yankee games in the mid-90s. And Andy Pettit was about the same size as a 6'5". I pitched about at 235 or 240 then. But he could do things with the ball already at age 22 that I couldn't have done. And so you began to notice how much more athletic and talented. I don't think the game is as good. I don't think the subtle skills, bunting, or just one little example. Now, if we were behind for 3 runs, the 8th inning, and the pitcher goes to 2-0, you're going to take a strike. You're going to make it. Now, the pitch is out there, and some guy's wailing away to try to hit it out of the ballpark. Mm-hmm. And you need base runners to get 3 runs. So, and I kind of blame management for that. They've kind of let this power game overcome the game, the way the game was invented and the way we liked it. That's why I have a teammate like Rod Carew, Wade Boggs, and then I mentioned Tony Gwynn. I think the only guy that plays the game like that is Stephen Kwan from Cleveland. You know, he finally got a chance. He was not given much of a chance to play, and he's a big part of that team. So I wish there were more teams like that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned sitting on the bench for 2 years better than your career great. Can you expand on that? Tell us more about what part of that gave you the greatest.
Well, see, if they wanted to discourage the wealthier teams from stockpiling this talent by paying them $25,000, $30,000 and sending them to the minor leagues. So they said, okay, if you're going to give a player that kind of money, you got to give up a spot on your roster. So that's what they did, for example, with Sandy Koufax. My great friend, late teammate Harmon Killebrew was one of those. And it looked like for a while, he might not make it. He was hitting about 180 in AAA. And, you know, he got signed for $35,000 in 1955, came right up to the big leagues. You're not, it's like if you're 16 years old and you're a good golfer and they say go play the PGA Tour, you're probably not ready for it. But that's what they did to discourage players, but there was a lot of players that got the money and didn't make it because they sat there. They might get a few at bats or pitch a few innings, but they never really got a chance to develop their craft. Yes, Tom.
Jim, any thoughts or memories on my boyhood idol, Roberto Clemente?
Yeah, I wish we'd have had interleague play. I faced him when the Pirates trained in Fort Myers in spring training, and then in the '66 All-Star game, that was quite a thrill for me. It was my second All-Star game, but I didn't pitch in the first one, and so in those 2 innings, I faced Mays, Clemente, Aaron, McCovey, Santo, and then my future teammate Dick Allen. And Roberto got a single. Mays got I got Hank Aaron out. But yeah, I mean, I remember listening to, was it KDKA?
Yeah.
And I could hear the gunner, Bob Prince. And yeah, we all knew what a great player Roberto was, but in the American League, you know, we didn't get to see him that much. Yes?
Just 2 questions, Jim. Who was the most difficult out as a pitcher?
Al Kaline.
And then
You heard that name, Al Kaline?
Yeah.
Tigers outfielder, got to know Al well. Later he was a broadcaster. And I said, Al, when I went into Detroit, staying at that Sheraton Cadillac, it was my turn to pitch. I said, I'd walk out there, it'd be a nice shiny limousine there. You wanted to make sure I got to the park and didn't get hurt. You wanted your forehead pass. But yeah, he was my toughest. Brooks Robinson hit almost as high an average. Reggie Smith, but Al did a lot of damage.
if I could, the second question, in the '67 season, the final few weeks when the Twins and Tigers finished the game behind the Red Sox, any particular stories for the finish of that season?
Do you know those stories?
I'm waiting for you to tell us.
Yeah. You want to hurt my feeling?
No.
Well, the '67 pennant race was probably still the best pennant race ever because you didn't have playoffs. And we had 4 teams that had a chance to win with 4 days left. And the White Sox got swept by Kansas City. So it came down to, we're playing the Red Sox 2 games and we need to win 1. I was pitching on Saturday. And Yaz and Hawk Harrelson have always been pretty kind about that because it was by far the best month of pitching I ever had in my career. And I was rolling along and all of a sudden the 4th inning, boom, it's like when you hit your funny bone. I tore the elbow, which is the Tommy John injury, but they didn't have the surgery then, so I had to come out of the game. They won that game, then they beat us on Sunday. And actually, when I went over to congratulate, I had a former teammate, Lee Stang, that was on that team. So I went over to the Red Sox clubhouse to congratulate them, and they were all listening to the radio. You know, you didn't have cable TV, because the Tigers were going to the 9th inning of the 2nd game of their doubleheader, and if they won it, there'd be a playoff game on Monday. And Dick McAuliffe into a double play to end the game, and then the Red Sox popped the champagne. And then later I was a teammate, locker mate of Jim Lonborg, who was a big hero for those Red Sox. So I count it a privilege that I helped start Red Sox Nation. Yeah.
We got 4 teams left playing this year.
Yeah.
Do you have an assessment on how this might turn out? Who do you like?
Well, he's asking about the 4 teams this year, and I said early on, in the short series you don't know, but I think Houston is the best overall team, now that the Braves and the Dodgers are out of it. But any one of these teams, as we've seen, you know, you get a well-pitched game like the Phillies got from Wheeler, short series. You know, in the way the specialized pitching is, you know, who's got the best relievers? You know, one trivia question I run past some of my friends is when is the last World Series where every win was a complete game win? And that's in 1965 when we played the Dodgers. And I hooked up kind of a clever story that usually gets a chuckle out of people is, you know, I pitched against Sandy Koufax 3 times that series. And he started game 2 instead of game 1 because of Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur, so he didn't pitch game 1. So I drew him in game 2. Well, Drysdale starts game 1, and we knock him out in 4th inning. So Alston, the manager, goes out to take the ball from Drysdale, and Drysdale looks at him and says, bet you wish I was Jewish, don't you? But and Sandy, I'm honored to say that Sandy specifically came to the induction this year to support me. Because when I got a call from him, he said, you know, you're in my age bracket. He's 86. He said, some of these young guys are, you know, Sandy Koufax has been a Hall of Famer for 50 years. Wow. Yeah, that's the longest. Bob Feller at one time had the longest, but now Sandy. And so I'm thrilled to be able to get to know him as a friend, and the fact that he was there. Yes?
Could you tell us what it was like to pitch to Ted Williams?
Well, the question was, what was it like to pitch to Ted Williams? Now, in the late 50s, they didn't have a lot of security like you do today, so we stayed at the Kenmore Hotel, which was about a 5-minute walk from Fenway Park. So, being raised on baseball lore, I knew what Fenway Park looked at like from the aerial shot. So I said, I got to get out there, and you know, I walked down the foul line and counted the dents where Bobby Dorr and Vern Stevens and all those hitters had hit. But every day Williams played pepper. Nowadays players don't know what pepper is, but that's just kind of where you're bunting the ball, watching the ball hit the bat. And he played that every day with Tom Yawkey and Johnny Orlando, the clubhouse man. So I get there and there's Williams playing pepper, and I'm just sitting in the stands. I'm probably the only person there other than the ground crew. Well, then later in that series, I get to the last day of the season, they said, we're going to pitch each of the rookies. I had some minor back surgery, so I hadn't pitched in 6 weeks. I said, well, pitch the first inning today. So when Ted came up, I turned around to my second, I said, I'm pitching against Ted Williams, you believe this? You know? And I got him 0-2, and he hit one off the wall left field. But I did get him out the next year, and to show you how into the game and the memory he has is I was going up to play a course called Black Diamond in Central Florida in the early 90s. And Ted Williams had his hitting museum in Central Florida. Citrus, I think it was Florida. So I walk in I said, Williams ever play golf? He said he's on the 17th fairway right now with Eddie Feiner, the famous softball pitcher. So they let me take a car. They took my friend Doc Gallagher. We drive out there, and Ted's walking off the 17th green. I waited. I walk. I said, Mr. Williams. He looked at me. He said, oh, give me that Mr. Williams stuff. I know who you are, lefty. You know, trying to throw me that curveball. so yeah, he was John Wayne in a baseball suit. Yeah, he really was. Yeah. Yes.
Did you ever get to face Stan Musial at spring training?
You know, I really don't. I don't think I did. Yeah. I don't think I got to know Stan well, but I never did get to face him. Yeah, he's probably one of the really, they talk about, you know, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle. One guy that gets forgotten is Frank Robinson, who's right there with him, and then Musial. Yeah, great player in all phases. John.
Yes, did you ever pitch a complete game shutout and also hit a home run in that game?
Is that a trick question? Yeah. You know the answer.
It took me a month to figure it.
Yeah. I did that twice. Yeah. I think Twins pitchers have done it 3 times, and I did that too. But when we would lose a close game and we're walking up the tunnel, Harmon Killebrew would say, hey, you know how to stop this, shut them out and hit one out. And, so that was kind of a pitcher's dream. So I got to do that twice and pitch a complete game, which, pardon?
A rare feat.
Yeah, well, it's a feat that won't happen today. Yes.
What are your thoughts about the rule changes next year on the no shifting? Putting the bolt back on both sides of the infield?
Amen.
On the dirt. What do you think?
Well, I think they have to do it because the hitters were too stupid to take advantage of the shift. Yeah. I mean, you watch these games and they're shifting, and one team needs a single and the whole left side of the field is open. But you know, the analytics, the scientists are saying it's easier to score a run with 1 home run than it is with 3 singles. Well, that kind of depends on who you're facing and time. So I think out of necessity, they need to do that. I don't know how much impact it's going to have. I think the pitch clock, and again, it's a shame that baseball has to resort to these rules. I mean, these guys are all adults. You go to the minor leagues and you teach guys, this is the way we play. You don't step out of the box. You get the ball, you get your sign, you throw it, let's play ball. But because they don't, now I noticed I was doing a Tiger series earlier this year, Tigers and Twins. And I noticed the Detroit pitchers were really working at a nice pace. And the day after, before the game, I saw Dan Petrie. I don't know if you remember that name, but he pitched where Jack Morris pitched for the Tigers. I said, Dan, man, your pitchers are getting after it. He said, well, they're all coming up from the minor leagues where they're using the pitch clock. So now with this 15, I still think there's going to be some violations because you can't change a player's habits if they've done it for 10 or 12 years just by instinct. You know, I remember when they said you got to stay in the batter's box. Well, Big Papi started, you know, out of the box, everybody does, and you can't enforce it. So you really have to do it in the minor leagues. So I think those 2 changes might make a difference. I'm not sure. I think actually the 2 fastest ways, if they want to increase if they want to pick up the pace of play, is you deaden the ball and you regulate the bat, because the bats are like steel pipes now. The bats we used out of ash had a lot of moisture in them. So most guys swung like a 35-ounce bat. You gave a 35-ounce bat like the Barry Bonds, you'd think he was swinging a lead bat, because they're using 31 light, dry, and with a lively ball. So you do those 2 things, and then you ban batting gloves. So they don't have to step out and fasten and refasten. And I can't imagine why a company has not come along that can't come up with a glove that you don't have to refasten and step out of the box every pitch. You wear batting gloves?
Yes.
You refasten them?
Yeah, a lot.
Do you? See, that's what makes the game longer. Yes.
Do you have any particular stories on Vin Scully and particularly his advice to you as a broadcaster?
The question was about Vin Scully. The only stories I have is that I got to know Vin, which was a real privilege. See, when we played in the World Series in '65, the local broadcasters shared doing the game. So Vin was the voice for the Dodgers, Ray Scott was the voice for the Twins. And then when I did an occasional network game on TV, I always stopped in the booth to visit with Vin. No, my best advisors announcing-wise came from Bill White, who kind of disciplined me to never compromise your credibility, be honest and objective. Dick Enberg taught me a lot, Dick Stockton. And then I did a game one night, I did a network game in Chicago, and then I caught a flight and I was doing a Twins game that same night. They wanted me to, because it was an over-the-air game. So I walk in the booth, and they just finished the national anthem. So I have my lineup sheet, and that's it. So I'm just watching the game. And the next day, I called my partner, Dick Stockton. I said, I did a game last night with no notes. And I said, I felt like I was really more engaged in that game than any other game. He said, well, that's what Madden does. So he hooked me up, and I talked to John Madden. And he explained how if you do your homework and you're accurate with who the players are, what they can do, pronounce their names, you just talk about what's out there. If you have a lot of notes written, you're going to say, well, I got to get this one in, and maybe it doesn't pertain to the situation. So ever since then, I've kind of used the John Madden approach. I just sort of visualize that I'm sitting in the stands with 3 fans. One's a first timer, one's kind of a lukewarm fan, and one's a very avid fan. And I always appreciated the response I got all the years doing Yankee games, is when people would say, no, we learned something last night that we didn't know. So that, that makes you feel good because as a former player, supposed to know what's going on. Yes, sir.
Do you think the steroid era, those players, Clemens, Pettit, McGuire wouldn't make no
Sosa.
right? So,
A-Rod.
Bonds.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll get in the Hall of Fame?
Well, ironically, you mentioned that because I mentioned I've gotten to know Jane Clark quite well. I've had several appearances at the, I don't know if you know who Jane Clark is, but she's one of the wealthiest women and one of the most philanthropic women in the world. And she is the CEO of the Hall of Fame, and she is the main force. And we were talking about that. Well, and I'd always said, I thought there should be an exhibit in there for Pete Rose and just show what they did on the field. Well, actually, there are 23 of Pete Rose's artifacts in the Hall of Fame. There's the bat that he broke Cobb's record with. I was there that night. That was one of my favorite nights in baseball, September 11, 1985, when he broke Cobb's record. And so there's a lot of artifacts for those guys. But unless the writers decide to change directions, I mean, you got a guy like A-Rod who was suspended twice, and then he was suspended for a year, and then he sued the Yankees, and now he'd kind of like to get in the Hall of Fame. Well, I don't think that's going to happen, and he knows it. I've had my encounters with Alex, but I can't see it happening. But down the road, the writers might say enough's enough, and then once, I mean, I think even though they're not in the Dowd report, I think that most writers know there may be a few players in there that were steroid users, but they weren't in the famous Dowd report. But I don't think they'll get there. Yes, sir.
I just heard this the other day, and you probably know the details of it, but to the science that's morphed into the wonderful game, someone said a Dodger pitcher, I think this past June, was taken out after completing 7 straight, 21 batters or no hits, no runs, and they took him out.
Yeah.
Pitching a perfect game. I mean, it's laboring the point, but do you have knowledge of that game, or I guess it just supports what?
Well, we call them propeller heads, but the science, they say the third time through the batting order, these guys are not as effective. So once they worked through the batting order twice, we got to make a change. It was a famous game a few years ago when the Tampa took Snell out. He was pitching like Sandy Koufax. Well, I go back to my scientists were Warren Spahn, Whitey Ford, Robin Roberts. And so when I had a lesson from Warren Spahn, we were about to leave. We were playing an exhibition game against Milwaukee, and he said, "Kid, I got one more thing to tell you. When the game's tied in the 7th inning, the game's just starting. You got to learn to pitch Mickey Mantle differently in that 4th at bat." So that's what we learned to do, and now they're not trained to do that. They're trained, here's the ball, give us one time through the batting or whatever. And it's kind of, like I said, the only thing as a kid I wanted to do was be a baseball player.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, if I'm a kid today, and I say, I want to be a starting pitcher in the big leagues and pitch 3 innings and make $10 million. The money sounds good, but the challenge wouldn't appeal to. I want this little guy to pitch 9 innings or 7 innings, right? Yeah. Because, competition is what it's all about. You can get all the awards, but when you get one of these and you're the last team standing, that's the most satisfying feel there is, feeling for a professional athlete. Yes.
The section that we're talking about with Barry Bonds and all the drugs that they're taking, but we can go back into the 30s and 40s with them all cheating with the spitballs and the shy balls, and they were playing games and calling everybody, all the black players this and stuff like that. But all those guys are in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
So now maybe we need to have a different section of the Hall of Fame where you can take steroids and still be in the Hall of Fame. Because
Well,
all those jerks-
I mentioned that to Jane Clark, but I think the way they looked at things then was more of a misdemeanor than a felony. I don't know, but yeah, yes.
Jim, you were quite a fielder. And you
Quite
had
what?
a number of gold gloves.
Yeah,
How many gold gloves do you have?
16.
So when you went to Holland College, Holland?
Hope College.
Okay. Were you a natural fielder or was there a mentor?
I learned to field my position. I learned to field my position listening to the radio. Does that make sense? So my boyhood hero was Bobby Shantz. Bobby Shantz was 5'7", 135 pounds. I texted him to wish him a happy birthday. He turned 97. Wow. At age 80, I gave him a legacy award at the Rawlings Gold Glove Dinner. I said, how often does an 80-year-old get to give an award to his boyhood hero who was 93? But I could listen to 8 games on a Sunday afternoon back in the 40s and early 50s because the Cubs, White Sox, Braves, when they moved there, and the Tigers all played a doubleheader. My dad was a Philadelphia Athletics fan. For some reason, he took a liking to Connie Mack. As Connie Mack owned the team, he always had to sell his players off to meet payroll. So he's pulling for the underdog. Well, they had this little left-hand pitcher, Bobby Shantz, and the announcer would say, here's Bobby Shantz, best fielding pitcher in baseball. Lands in the balls of his feet. He's always ready for a ball hit back to him. He can go left, he can go right. And so I'd go in my backyard and bounce a tennis ball off the garage doing the same thing. 1958, I go to my first spring training. We go through the pitcher's drills, and the coach said, kid, you look just like Bobby Shantz. So that was a great compliment. So that's, it's nice to be able to still stay in touch with Bobby, but that's kind of how I modeled my pitching motion after, because it was important. And now a lot of pitchers are getting, because of all the emphasis on power, they're not really back in position to, to field the ball.
What's your fastest pitch?
I have no idea.
Was it before?
We never kept, the first time I can remember the radar gun was when I coached the pitchers for Pete Rose in Cincinnati for 2 years. And the value I saw in it was, like we had a pitcher named Mario Soto, and his fastball was in the low 90s, which at the time was, first of all, when you see TV and the guy's throwing 101, it's about 93 when it gets to home plate. It loses a mile per hour every 7 feet on average. So, but anyway, Mario's fastball was in the low 90s, and he had a great changeup. But if his changeup wasn't at least 10 miles an hour slower than his fastball, that's when it seemed to get hit. So you could use the radar gun for that. But we never heard of it or used it. Bob Feller got tied with a motorcycle one time. You probably know that story. But we didn't count pitches, we just counted outs. My favorite statistic was always, if we get 27 outs and we are 1 run ahead of the other team, our winning percentage is 100%. And that's what we were after. Yes?
So there used to be like kind of a trick question about 20 years ago that I remember, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the question was, there was one switch hitter to win the MVP since Mickey Mantle. And the answer was, the trick answer was Vida Blue.
Right.
Is that true?
That's true. Yeah. Vida Blue won it as a pitcher, and he was a switch hitter. Yeah. Ed, you tell me when it's time to quit. Yes, right here.
This is it's not a baseball question, but it's out of left field. So, but you've spent your life all over the country, so many places, and you live here now. And what brought you to Northshire?
I'll tell you that story, and then I'll tell you a unique question that our driver asked us yesterday that kind of ties into that. But I was widowed in 2008, and Margie, who I'm married to, had been widowed for 17 years, and she was a golf pro. And she was a pro at a club in Florida in the wintertime, and I knew a couple that were members there, and they knew my late wife. So at the service I had in my backyard, my sister-in-law said to Marge McAleese, if Jim ever gets ready to see someone, we think we'll have a prospect. Because Margie was widowed, she had no kids, she was a golf pro, I love golf. So they put us together, and it moved along quite fast, and we got married. We're going on 14 years now, but Margie grew up in Bennington. So we spent the first summer in Michigan, played a lot of golf, then we came here. Let's spend the summer here. Of course, fell in love with it. Now she's a fisherman instead of a golfer. But the question, this driver yesterday, as we're going to the airport, he said, what are the 3 favorite places you visited? So they were asking the different people. And my first one was New Zealand, because if I were younger, I'd move there. And then I liked Korea, because I did the South Korea, because I did the 1988 Olympics there and saw how they rebuilt Seoul. And I said the third one is probably right where I'm living now, Vermont. I said Vermont is like no other state in the country, and I love it in the summer and the fall. So I'm so happy that we found Vermont and ended up here. Yes, Ed?
Jim, we're going to give the last question to Martha.
Hi, Martha.
Hi.
It's my neighbor.
I just noticed there are many young people in the audience, and I think that they're future ball players or current ball players. I wondered if you have any suggestions or any inspirations that you share.
Well, I met one refresh my memory again. Ethan, right. I met Ethan, and you know, I get asked a lot, what advice would you give like a young pitcher? And see, that's so difficult for me today, because the pressure on young players is, as a pitcher, if you want to get I was kind of his mentor. John Stuper was a teammate of mine in St. Louis, and he coached Yale for 30 years. And he goes to these camps now that high school kids are trying out. And if you're a pitcher and you don't throw 90 miles an hour, they don't want to give you a college scholarship. It's like a kid that can't drive at 300 yards. But I would just say to any young kid that the percentages of making it to the major leagues, we all know. I mean, I don't feel like I accomplished anything special. I just feel like I was gifted with something that enabled me to live out my dream. But every kid is not going to get that. The percentages are not high. But enjoy the game and learn how to be a good teammate. You learn how to support your buddies. Learn discipline, humility, accountability. And I think I see that when I see one of my favorite teams that I got to watch was my granddaughter's fast pitch softball team in New Jersey. I mean, these girls were so disciplined, and they hit the cutoff man, and they were to practice on time, and they were all pulling for one another. And so that's, I think, where you learn your real life lessons. And then if you're fortunate to parlay that into a career, that's a bonus. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.